Well, thank you, and thank you for choosing to listen to me rather than go out for a break, and or for taking a quick break and already being back. I am a postdoc at North Carolina State, where I work with Professor Jason Delborn on the role of engagement in the governance of environmental applications of gene editing. And as a social scientist working on engagement, I'm kind of very encouraged by the discussions taking place here, discussions that recognize the importance of engagement for the future of CRISPR, but that also grapple with the challenges of actually doing engagement. So I'd like to just provide a few of my insights from working in this realm. So as a way of framing this talk, there have been both calls for engagement and calls for science and risk-based decision-making surrounding gene editing. And while it may seem that these would stand in conflict, I would like to propose that with the right understanding of the role of value judgments in gene editing, these two necessarily relate. There are 3 points I'd like to put forward. First, that value judgments permeate gene editing practices. Second, that these value judgments are often not recognized. And third, that engagement enables needed recognition of and reflection on these judgments. So I'll spend the rest of my time exploring these points and how they can inform the future of gene editing. So beginning with the definition, a value judgment is a subjective assessment based on one's own code of values. So these are values-laden judgments based on our worldviews, values, and lived experience. And all along the many stages of gene editing decision-making, as we've heard over the past day and a half, there are values-laden decisions that need to be made, such as what is the problem to be addressed, what are preferred solutions, are non-gene editing alternatives considered, what research is prioritized, how specifically are products designed, what does safe mean, how are risk assessments designed, whether, when, where, and how to deploy the products of gene editing, and who gets to decide all of these types of questions. And the important thing is how we answer these questions will influence the trajectories gene editing takes, including what products are developed and what potential benefits and harms will be realized, as well as how they will be distributed. So how, then, does engagement relate to the values-laden nature of gene editing? Well, engagement offers a way to help recognize where these values-laden decisions exist and to reflect on what's at stake and how we make them. So engagement can be defined as seeking and facilitating the sharing and exchange of knowledge, perspectives, and preferences between or among groups who often have differences in experience, power, and values. So this is from the recent NASEM report on gene drives. So this includes engagement with affected communities, stakeholders, expert stakeholders, NGO groups, and other publics. But it can also include engaging with colleagues from a different discipline. The key thing here is to find those who have different knowledges, perspectives, and preferences who can help us see and reflect upon our value judgments that impact our decision-making. So I'd like to transition and focus on one of these areas in more depth, and that's specifically the area of risk assessment, both because it's important for environmental applications of gene editing. New traits and new organisms being released into the environment poses a lot of challenges for risk assessment, but also because risk assessment is often seen as an area far away from value judgments, an area or a thing that objectively synthesizes science for decision-making. When in reality, there's an established literature recognizing and exploring the role of value judgments in risk assessment. So these are values-laden decisions that are essential to the risk assessment process, such as which potential adverse effects and risk pathways are studied, what temporal and spatial scales are used, what species are tested, how is significant harm defined. And the importance of these questions is that they delimit the study of risk. They create selective ignorance that we should be aware of. So selective ignorance referring to the wide range of often subtle research choices or value judgments that lead to the collection of some forms of knowledge rather than others. And I would argue engagement is a way to recognize how our judgments create certain forms of selective ignorance and how we may want to not have those forms of ignorance and have other forms of ignorance. So some wrapping up points going forward. As many of you are aware, and as I've heard at this meeting, once you open the door to engagement, you are faced with a new set of challenges, navigating the tensions and paradoxes that emerge when pursuing deliberative democracy in the context of science and technology. And although we don't have time to delve into this, it is safe to say that there are many established literatures across different disciplines on these topics, and many social science and humanities colleagues who would be more than willing to engage and collaborate on these issues. But I'd like to point to a couple of areas of scholarship that exists around this specifically. So the discipline of science and technology studies and of science and technology policy has for multiple decades engaged with this question of how do we insert engagement into decision-making around science and technology. And a more recent incarnation of this is in the responsible research and innovation field, which is an emerging literature based on a lot of the same fundamental ideas. And so I'd like to just point to a few of the ideas coming out of these literatures to conclude. So one is the importance of pursuing upstream engagement, and this point has been made multiple times over the past couple of days. The earlier engagement takes place, the easier it is to respond to it, whether that means altering the design of a technology or the scope of a risk assessment. Seeking to go into engagement, seeking to understand, reflect, and be open to change, as opposed to being stuck in one's views and trying to convince. Including critical voices, the best way to see one's own assumptions and value judgments is to engage and receive feedback from someone who does not share them. Furthermore, to push away critical or neutral voices will increase the blind spots that you have on issues and increase the likelihood that you inadvertently cause harm or miss an opportunity to create a more desired product. In addition, there are issues of power at play, clearly in the question of who's included. There are stakes in who gets a seat at the table. And finally, how we design engagement matters. We need to design engagement to be specific to the decision context. So what decisions and value judgments are at play? Who are the right participants to provide the feedback and reflection on them? And what level of expertise is needed to do so? So to engage with risk assessment takes a higher level of expertise, and that's an okay thing. So while I didn't have the time to get into some case studies, there are multiple different projects building upon these ideas that are being undertaken by different people in Jason Delborn's lab. For example, a project on spotted-winged Drosophila that uses engagement to inform risk assessments and broader deliberations on potential management strategies for this pest. A project studying engagement in the governance of the genetically modified American chestnut tree, a tree that was designed to restore the functionally extinct species that was decimated by blight in the early 1900s and is now poised to undergo regulatory review as the first GMO designed to persist and spread in the wild. And a project with stakeholder and community engagement activities to explore the desirability of using a gene drive strategy to control invasive rodents that threaten biodiversity on islands. I'd be happy to talk with you further about any of this later, but in the spirit of engagement, I'm now not going to take any questions. So, thank you.